Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 8, and we're going to take a look at BattleCry. Before we dig in, let's just take a quick review of what Milestone 8 has. We're trying to round out the last few parts and pieces of functionality built into the game, and one of them that was a real critical piece was the history panel. And that's when you're in there playing and you look at a hex. Last week we were able to play the battle cry of the opponent, whatever the last battle cry was, dealing with this hex. What this will do is this will bring up a history docket and sort of detail out all of the attacks and then allow you to play each one of the battle cries associated with that. So that was one of the last remaining major pieces to sort of round out the game. Another big piece this week, which was really the majority of it, you'll notice I'm 22 hours in of a 15-hour estimate, was the graphics and reskinning. So first round, that didn't do as well as I would have liked it to have done, but we recovered quite nicely, but it was just a lot of work. So we'll take a quick look at that. And then the last piece, which we've got two parts of the tutorial. We've got tutorial part 1 and 2. Next week is part 2. With part 1, we were just trying to get the groundwork for the tutorial in place. What does it look like? What's it going to be presented to the user? How am I going to manage it? And try to get at least the lists covered this week. Next week we're going to go back in. I'll identify some areas that need some tweaking from the tutorial system in general, and then we'll carry that on into the game and basically have the tutorial complete out the game. And we addressed just a couple of bugs during game creation. There was a visibility on the pop-up box that was allowing the player, even if they had reached their 5-game limit on their battle cry, to still continue to create another game. So we took care of that. And while playing the game, if you're in any of the shops while you're in a tack posture or a reinforced posture, it allowed you to go into an attack and reinforce while the shop list was still open, and it was just a bad user experience. So we took care of that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the hex history panel first and go through that, but before we dig into it, we're going to follow the similar platform. We're going to switch over and just show all the features that we worked on this week through the Android device, and then we'll fall back to the Apple device and basically drill down into each one of these features and then include a code review. All right, well, I hope you look forward to it, because I definitely do. This was a big milestone for me, and it definitely is coming together. So thank you, sit back, and let's take a look at what we've built. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz, and we're looking at Milestone 8, and as typical, I'm going to go ahead and record through my iPhone onto the Android device. So we'll go ahead and boot it up, and what we're going to do is just do a quick look through the main task for Milestone 8 this week, which was creating the individual hex history. And I'm going to try to keep the phone a little bit away from the Android so you're not overwhelmed by the audio. We're going to look at the graphics upgrade, so that's going to be kind of ubiquitous as we move through the interface. And you'll be able to dig in a little bit. It'll be a little bit cleaner when we show this off through the iPhone. And the last big piece is to go through the tutorial, which you may see a part and piece of that as well when we go through this. All right, let's go ahead and log out. So we've done quite a bit of work on updating all of the graphics, managing all of the various lists and the menu system to be able to get through everything as well. You'll notice that there's a new tutorial complete checkbox. This is for having the ability to replay the tutorial. But generally all the lists have been updated, and the graphics look a little bit cleaner, not quite as flat. Just a general wildness to the game at this point. So let's head into the game. So at this point, let's see if I can find one that might have some old history to it. Once again, I'm trying to poke around my screen, not doing a great job at it. So let's go ahead and just attack something. Let's create some additional history here. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. I apologize for yelling in your ear, but not a really easier way to do this since I'm recording from one device to the next. Alright, running all over the place. Alright, so if I pull the history on this, so what you see here is sort of a dialogue, and it allows me to play the audio once that finishes downloading. But, blah, 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 blah. And it tells me that the sector was owned by savages and was attacked by me, Hearthdale, with how many infantry, how many cavalry, and how many archers, and I was victorious. So when we get to the code, we'll see how that's pulled together. Generally speaking, all the parts and pieces have all been reskinned. All of our iconography and graphics look a little bit better. We've only diverged a couple of areas. We're trying to use these shields. I don't want to spend all my money. Hold on. We're trying to use these shields as interactive buttons, but as you can see here with the blah, 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 there's a couple of places where we're using board shapes to denote touchable, and then we're trying to use these stone or graphic icons here to be, non-touchable items. So hopefully this will make things a little bit more obvious to the player, what to click on, what not to click on. Blah, 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 blah. So again, what you're seeing here, as far as the history is concerned, is if it's an older game before the introduction of the Milestone 8 history docket, all the extra information wasn't there. That's new code added this week, so only new hexes will have the full docket. You'll see the entries there because we've always been tracking the battle cries, and you should be able to play them and know what date they were. But as far as the details of the battle, that's fairly new. That is new for this week, Milestone 8. So we can play through and dig into each one of the various parts and pieces, but this is showing off all of the new graphics. It is showing off the lists, so let's take a quick gander at the tutorial piece. So I'm going to go ahead, it says tutorial complete. I'm going to uncheck it so tutorial is not complete. And what you're seeing there is, and I'll get a little bit closer, that's Baxter Battle Axe. That's the character I'm using to introduce the tutorial. And he introduces himself and tells you he's going to teach you how to become a barbarian lord. So you'll notice that I had the little triangle there to note something I can click. So if it's something that's being driven by the story by Baxter himself, there'll be a little triangle there to click on. If it's something that the tutorial wants you to click on in the game, then it'll present a little knife or dagger or sword thing and tell you to poke it. So you'll notice I don't have one here because it's wanting me to create a new game. Alright, so again, trying to record and do this, so hang on just a second. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. And you'll notice that Baxter flies out of scene when you're doing the battle cry to make sure he's not interfering with any of the pop-ups, and then flies back in. The screen is switched to pending. He's now talking about what pending games are and how to use those. We can read them and become a little bit more attentive with it. And then it's asking me to go to the open games, so it's going to describe the open games. And it pulls up a list of open games and says these are the players' challenges, blah, blah, blah. So it's what are open games. and then it's telling me, hey, why don't you select this and try to join this game. And then of course he flies out of scene again. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, go first. And he flies back, and it's now moved me to active games, and it says from here you can take your turn and play blah blah blah. So I also have an icon here, and I'll get a little bit more detailed into what I think the shortcomings of this strategy are, a little bit more work that I think needs to happen, but we'll go ahead and finish it out. So here it's talking about the little audio files, and of course the friend icon, and then encourages them to look or click on the friend icon. Select here to see your list, but you don't actually have to select there at this point. There's your high scores, just pointing those out. And then at that point, that's the 10-cent tour. So the goal here was not to do a full harbor tour of the entire interface, but just to focus on the key elements: creating a new game, what are pending games, what's an open game, how to join a game to get in and play, where would I play from, what are friends, what are high scores, and then still leave enough of the interface for the user to kind of explore and look at things. And at that point, that concludes the tutorial. Alright, so that's everything at a glance on the Android. So we're going to dig into these verticals one at a time on the iPhone and then review the code. Alright, thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. We're going to look at issue 3063, Milestone 8. Specific issue is 3064, the Hex History panel. So what we have here is all of our updated graphics that we've been working on this week. By far the graphics and reskinning has been the most arduous part of Milestone 8 by any definition. Let me just see if I can glance here at my map and see a couple of areas that I might have attacked. We'll attack that one. Blah, blah, blah. Death, death. Blah, blah, blah. Death, death. Alright, we're going to go ahead and fight. So now if I come over here and look at my history, I see that today I attacked at 4/14/2019 and with all of my details. And I can replay blah blah blah, death, death, that particular battle cry. So that kind of completes the process. We had it where the enemy you will pay with your life. where the enemy was automatically playing the battle cry for me as I'm interacting again, trying to keep me engaged with my my opponent. And there's no history for this hex. You will pay with your life. We do have history. So this one shows that Xander attacked with a bunch of infantry, a bunch of cavalry, and very few archers. And I can see, you will pay with your life. And I will pay with my life. So, and of course, there isn't one for the castle or what have you. And if there is no history, you'll get there is no history. So ultimately, that was the big final piece. So let's take a quick gander at the code and see how that all gets put together. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 8, and we are taking a look at issue 3064, Hex History panel. So very much similar to the other lists, we'll start here in Unity and take a look at how we're building this. We have our history panel, scroll view, viewport, content, and we have our hist data item, which is what this is. The crux of all of the logic is on the load history. It's where I map all of my parts and pieces, and this is the datum, again mapping all the parts and pieces. So all we're doing really at this point from the button is managing visibility on the history panel, turning off the other panels, and on the history panels activeness, which really is part of the load history. It does a refresh, loads everything when you open it up. So let's take a quick look at the code. So digging into the code, we have our load history. This is beyond similar to the other list items. We have a loader, and it creates a datum, and that datum is based off of prefabs. So here's our prefab. Here's the content area I'm adding it as a child for. Here's the audio source I'm using to be able to replay the BattleCry. And of course, these are all my primary components that are all passed down from the game controller. API call, current player, game controller, and audio manager. So once a load command has been sent out to the API, so let's scroll down a little bit here to this, and this is the show hex history. That on wake up, basically we get a little bit of a quarter of a second wait just for everything to spin up, otherwise I end up getting a bunch of null references. And then do a show history, and then of course on enable it kickstarts a code routine for wake up, which does the show history as well. So essentially the filter action we're doing here is get actions, so we're still calling the same API controller. So let's go to declaration here, and we're basically calling the Kryza controller, which is the middleware piece, and we're passing in the game filter, which is game actions, which just tells the store procedure, hey, get me these specific set of BattleCries. The only thing that's really unique under the hood at the SQL layer for this is at this point, since I'm getting back the list, it's null for the BattleCries in the list, and then I individually call back down for each one of the BattleCries. Otherwise, there could be 100 of them in that list, and all with 24,000 bytes plus UU encoded, very, very fat. That could get out of control on the list load. So that's the only real uniqueness there for that piece. So as it calls and loads, this is its callback routine, and this is literally what does all the work. So it serializes everything from JSON into JSON objects, which is my model, and I clear out anything that was there before just to keep the list clean. I make sure that all of my pop-ups are closed. That's just a de facto standard. And then I go through my looping mechanism, what all is in here. Now, again, at this point, I want to make sure, because really all I have is the ability to say, give me the BattleCries for the game. I haven't really tried to get down to the skinny where I'm passing more and more data to my controllers. And without the BattleCry, without having the actual audio data, even if there were 1,000 BattleCries datums sitting in there, that's very little data. Right? Very, very tiny amounts of data. So at that point, I iterate through it, and I'm looking for those that match my X and my Y, and I just do the filtering here at the code level. Because at some point, I'm going to reuse this, and I might have, hey, give me a docket for the entire game. I don't want to have to meander through each list, because ultimately what I came down to when I was playing with this is having the skip turn, in turn, and all that stuff is not related to the hex at all. So there's a lot of stuff in the BattleCry docket that's not necessarily tied to it. So in this case, I'm really minimizing the query down to those things associated with a specific hex. So it would be a make sense upgrade to the game as I move forward is, just give me a game docket. Give me everything that's happened in the sequence that's happened, irregardless of a hex. So this is just giving me the ability to look at a hex history itself. So at this point, as I'm pulling in all of my data, the date logic just looked horrible with the time code because they were all midnight AM. So I'm just stripping that stuff off because SQL puts it on there by default for me. It's real nice of SQL. And I'm just loading up all of my my audio sources. What was the action? It's always going to be attack in this case. What's the description around the action? And loading up some of my other tracking IDs, and then of course wiring up my on-click to be able to play. And once I load all of those, then my data item becomes the piece in question. So this is my processing of my audio. We've seen this since the beginning. This is the callback that calls process audio to play it. And then essentially the only action on the history is to play BattleCry. So that's between the load and the hiss. That's how we display it. So to me, the more interesting parts are the upgrades to the BattleCry itself. Let me just close this out and let me go to processor. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been, I don't know, maybe Freudian slip, where I have not been really discussing at length opportunities to improve the code. But this guy right here, look at this. That is, whew, look at all that. That is too much, way too much. And I've mentioned in the past that all of these list loaders, they're so similar, and the data items are so similar that I would probably get a lot of efficiency out of creating a parent class that housed all of the common wire up that I do for these pieces, and only implement the divergent pieces in the child classes. So that's a huge opportunity for improvement just from code clarity. I don't know if it'll be more efficient, but if I have to go and touch these, I have to bring this touch across every one of the data items right now because I don't have that object-oriented hierarchical design. And unfortunately, it was one of those realizations as I was going from list to list and lists how common these were. I didn't really have a clear picture at the design level whether I was going to be there. But the game controller is quickly out of control. Just needs to be sort of revisited in its entirety as things were needed. I'm just bolting things on here. So I could spend a week just redoing the game controller code and compartmentalizing a lot of this logic. It's really gotten a little bit out of hand. So that's a huge area for improvement, and I do have that noted. It's going to be kind of a rewrite of the way that this code, if nothing else, breaking it up into more manageable pieces because I think I'm in the thousands. I'm definitely well past the thousands of lines of code at this point. Okay, so back to task 3064. So one of the things that we're doing here is as we create the BattleCry, and I may or may not have mentioned my love of XML, JSON. I love interoperable type of human readable text that I can convert into objects. I really like that. But this also gives me a lot of flexibility for storage of metadata. So in this case, all I'm doing is noting that I'm attacking and the coordinates I'm attacking at and storing that as a BattleCry and going ahead and saving it. So because that's all I know at the time of the BattleCry is I create a BattleCry, I'm attacking something, but that's really all I do know. I don't know too much beyond that. So then when I get into my do combat, it gets to a point where let me grab my data rec from my current BattleCry and let me find out who owns it, right? Do I own it? Well, I would really never own it. I just need to know, is it an enemy or the savages is what I'm trying to calculate here. And then I'm prepping my description, right? Sector owned by whoever that hex owner is and is being attacked by me. I always know I'm the one attacking it. I'm not recording someone else's attack. And then I'm loading up the how much infantry, cavalry, and archers I have. So and the goal here being is that if I'm investigating my opponent's hex, and I'm seeing that they summoned all this stuff, right there to the right I can play their BattleCry, and I can begin to kind of learn from my opponent, right? What did they say, or how did they say it to generate all of those units? So again, it's one of the most advantageous ways to learn a game is by playing someone else and seeing how they play. All right, so then the last piece of that and we're carrying over is after I get all the way through the combat sequence, all the Exilium blowing up, it comes back in here and updates the current BattleCry with, blah, 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 and you were defeated or arose victorious. Right? And then in the in combat, it'll do another update the cry. So here's my current BattleCry, and then it saves it all back down. That sort of keeps it up to date. So I start with, I know I'm attacking, then when it gets into the combat sequence, okay, I know I'm attacking this guy, and I was able to summon this much stuff, and then after the combat, did I win or lose? So ultimately, that's the life cycle of it, and that's saving the data so that the loading and displaying can show it to you in a docket format that gives you sort of a history or a sequence of what's going on. Just through several of the games I've played, I try to build these bottlenecks where I'm just shoving as much of my garrison to that choke point as I can. And my son, who is my number one fan right now, is constantly battling it. So we'll have stuff going back and forth 10, 15, 20 times before the final overwhelmness of one of the players to take that hex occurs. So it allows you to kind of see the back and forth. And I could see there being, other interesting questions. Well, how many units did I lose? What were they facing? So there's opportunity there to even improve that docket. But rather than me trying to invent everything, those types of things of what's interesting to people, I want to put in front of a user and have them ask, hey, well, it'd be neat if I could see this. Well, of course you can, and we can upgrade that. So that's going to be kind of the user refinement. At any rate, that's the code in a nutshell. That is issue 3064, and I appreciate your time. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 8, and we are looking at issue 3065. We're going to upgrade the graphics. Just to give you a little bit of background, during the undergraduates program, I built my capstone project that way with the whiteout, very flat graphics, and then came in near the last milestone and added all the graphics and skinning and things of that nature. And then that was the taught behavior. That was the best practice of, build lightweight, prototypey looking graphics. Don't spend a lot of time on your meshes. Just put placeholders in place, things that are approximately the same size. Don't worry about textures. Don't worry about the look and feel of them, other than the fact that they're a good placeholder and analog for what's ultimately going to go there. And huge force multiplier. I've adopted that methodology in its entirety. Never again will I try to apply any kind of a high gloss to a product before I think, from a mechanical standpoint, all the mechanics are in place, all the basic rules and pops-ups and things that I want it to look and do are, for the most part, 90% or more above, right? Just because, to give a perspective, this is what you're seeing here from a game is 20 plus hours of dropping into place through the IDE. It's extremely verbose. Now, there could have been some parts and pieces where I could have created a texture manager, but the reality is there's just no way to get around 100% of getting your hands dirty, walking in there, tweaking the graphics. What does this texture look like with this type of text or color above it? And particularly challenging for me is I work mostly in chroma because I can't really tell the difference between certain colors. So what that does is that everything is always high contrast with me, for better or worse. It is what it is, and it's a way to show it. But some of the specifics I wanted to point out with this graphics overhaul is the use of shields for things that I can click on, things that I can manage. There's, like I said, there's a couple of deviations where we went really aesthetic over function. The pop-up for the BattleCry was one of them, and there's a couple where we go with the square, shows you, and that may be more in the game. Let me see if I can find one real quick. We saw it on login, the squarey buttons, to try to make that a little bit more intuitive on what I can and can't click on. And where I drove this point home was primarily in the sections of the game that were always being confused by players. So let me find a halfway decent game I can go into. Here, let's try this one. So this particular screen in general was rough. We've normalized the title bar at the top, making it more aesthetically pleasing, conducive to the time period of the game. The the actual icon denoting over here in the left hand corner. I know you can't see my finger, but we're next to the plains, the box that has the grass in it and has the forest in it, and maybe has mountains and stuff, and here's water and so on. Again, trying to make that just an icon. As I'm pressing on my 2 coins with the 1 byte, it says the sector is worth 1 resource. These are my you are currently generating 0 per turn, you're currently on 31 resources. But the things I want them to pay attention to is the buff button and the various hero shop and the shop for buffs and the history, those things. So these buttons are my primary buttons of concern that I want to really kind of stand out in this interface that I think that this swash of graphics has succeeded in doing. So let's just take a quick glance at this. Let's go into the attack. So again, the things that are informational, we're trying to really carve out, and the areas that I can poke on and do something with, I don't have any buffs, but are primarily these shields. Let's go over here, and same thing on reinforce. We've updated the reinforcement screens to make them where I've got these little triangles, and then I'm either flagging it or Xing out of it. And in fact, and again, as I mentioned last week, I've been putting this in front of users a lot more often than waiting to the final week to get some kind of feedback. And love this screen. Do not like my little flag down here in the lower right hand corner. Get out of that. Boom. Go back into it. Oh, I already buffed it. Bummer. Let's see, that's all good. Let's go to another game so I can talk about that. It doesn't matter which one. And I don't have anything to buff. Alright, let me attack something and then, well, I can't do it. Let me find another game. Hold on just a second. Lost my example. Not a good one. These are all, there's a game with multiple things. Goody goody. Alright, so let's just say that I'm going to reinforce the flag in the lower right hand corner, which is also the same flag I'm using at the top of the screen. At the top of the screen, this flag is for surrender. So right away I got called to the carpet this week. I didn't have a chance to change it, but I'm noted on my docket that I got to switch that icon out. They didn't want to press it because they thought they were surrendering. So that just needs to be a checkbox or something that is something other than using the same icon twice. So, but again, real easy to do at that point because that's a layered button using my original icons layered on top of a shield with a border around it, making it a little bit easier to look at. I'm debating on whether or not I want to swap out my flat icons here during combat, the little green flag versus the little red X. I think that's the color. Because the players resonated so well with those during my early testing that was so much better on what to do. I was concerned about swapping those out since they were had such great affordances to them. But I'm still toying with the possibility of maybe upgrading those as well. All right, so let's see, what have we not seen? This is the I can buy stuff. We've seen pop-ups. This is our buff shop. There. We've seen our history. We've seen our map. We've got our general holding type of thing. Nothing I can think of that's popping up that we have not seen. Let's head back out. This is our settings section, credit section, just a little more data, updating the same thing.
might need to log in as something else just to show you the buttons for those guys. I made those a little bit different because they're money buttons. But generally speaking, that's the entire game skinned out, and really like the process of what I call a whiteout build all the way up to the end and then skinning it out. But it was just extremely verbose, digging into the IDE mostly today, or this week. So let's take a look at that in the editor. Not a lot of code behind, but we can take a look at how we had to build these out and how we're putting together some of these graphics to make them a little bit standard and hopefully make the user interface a little better. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 8 with BattleCry, and we are going to take a look at issue 3065, which is the graphics update. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a look at these pieces, get everything back to the way it was. But let's taking a look at these icons. You'll see that we're using Plank 7, and this is part of the Wood UI asset. So we imported that from the asset store, and this is basically the crux of all of the little parts and pieces and graphics that we're putting together. Let's take a look at our layered buttons. So our map button. And all of our shield buttons essentially have the shield circle. Then as its internal image, it uses the circle background, as you can see here. And then beneath that is our familiar icon, which is our map whiteout. So one of the additions that we've added to our graphics is a lot of our graphics now have whiteout versions of them to allow us to essentially layer over top of various other graphics, giving us the ability to give it that depth and that textured look. So that's essentially how the shields are put together. Let's take a look at another scene. I don't think I want to save this. Save, no, don't save. And so this is our login scene. And we're managing this with panels as well. And we've got our little triangle icon. An interesting new thing that we did add during the development of the reskinning, something I had not used before, was the UI effects. So essentially that's in the add component, UI effects, and you can do an outline or you can do a shadow. And so I've been trying to add shadowing to a lot of these to give it more depth, to give it more pop. And figured while we're in here and I'm finding errors, I'm going to go ahead and fix them while I'm looking at them. But essentially, our panels have our background, which is this guy right here. And then we're layering a variety of components over top of that. So let's go back into the game logic, see if we can find a suitable replacement here. Let's go ahead and untarget that. Let's target that guy. So the pushback I got from my users this week was around this particular icon. So let's go ahead and move, get it a little bit better on the page as well. Get our little anchor point points in place. But again, this is our circle, and then our background, and then our whiteout image in itself. So one of the things we might want to swap this out for, just to make it a more obvious placement item. Let's see what we got here. I may have to do a little bit of research. Let's see, how about this guy? I think that might be a much better. Yeah, I think that works a lot better. So right away, already making it better. Isn't that wonderful? But essentially, that's as detailed as it gets. We've got our frame that we're working with, and then our various targets, and we're using the arrow left, which we've got from the UI asset, which are these two guys here, arrow left, arrow right, and they're just pivoted and used to push those units from one place to the next on the reinforce. The bulk of all of this, I would say really all of this is IDE development work. Nothing particularly code-based making this work, other than, as we saw before, the main active lists play button is generated, but we saw that from last milestone. So each one of these is using the whiteout icon over the background and the circle, which is basically the shield, these two pieces here, in an effort to try to normalize or standardize what I should be clicking on versus what is just informational. So haven't had a chance to put the final piece in front of users. I'm hoping to be able to get that done midweek to get a little bit more feedback on where we are from an affordance standpoint. Is it more obvious what to click on? I think as we saw from some of the other user tests, the user was just wildly clicking all over the screen. So the expectation here is that part of this graphics layer, this reskinning exercise, is we're going to give the user a lot more affordances on what it is that they should be doing from one screen to the next. And right off the bat, I'm fairly comfortable we're, if not there, definitely moving in the right direction, but the playtesters will be the ultimate decision. So a lot of this week's from the graphic skinning, while it was just a sheer number of hours on touching all the parts and pieces, was really just all done here within the IDE. Little to no coding whatsoever dealing with the reskinning, but I wouldn't expect as much either. So that's really much all I can do on the graphics update from the screencast. But if there's something else you would like me to look at, let me know. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 8. We are looking at issue 3066, tutorial part 1. And in the part 1 tutorial, the goal and objective was to help the player understand the main menu, the list interfaces, and generally to pipe out and sort of figure out what we want the tutorialing process to look like. So hence that within the settings screens there's a tutorial complete checkbox. I'm going to uncheck that to bring my Baxter guy back into play. And so what I've done to help the tutorial along is I've created this little character, Baxter Battle Axe. So this is sort of a compilation of layered graphics from the Wood UI asset that we purchased, and combined it together with a variety of other objects, and we'll take a look at that when we do the code review. But essentially, as he pops up, you are given this little triangle to move forward, which drives the tutorial story. And if you don't see that, that means that Baxter is wanting you to click on something on the screen. So we're going to go through it, but since we've already kind of seen this on the Android, I'm going to talk about areas that I think I need to improve this as we go into tutorial part 2 next week. So right off the bat, there's nothing stopping me from clicking around the screen, right? So I'm sitting here and he's doing an introduction, but I can go anywhere and do anything. So right off the bat, in addition to making the tutorial script work, I need to sort of control the user sort of going off rails. So to me, that's the number one flaw in this process, is that while I think the tutorial does a good job at introducing the user to the interface, because the user can just sort of go off rails and leave Baxter kind of sitting here unaware of what the user is doing, either I need to go ahead and bail out of the tutorial and assume the user's not interested in the tutorial, or I need to prevent the user from going off the rails. And if I'm leaning towards controlling the user's input so they go through the tutorial, but if I do that, I'm then going to need to give them the ability to abort the tutorial. Nothing's more frustrating, I assure you, having gone through it myself, than being locked into tutorial mode and just desperately trying to get to the game. So as it stands right now, this week was mostly about coming up with Baxter, understanding what the workflow, how I'm going to manage the workflow, how I'm going to do the animations and all that stuff. So let's go through it kind of working, and then I think it becomes pretty obvious that if the user goes off rails, I'm pointing at the wrong stuff. So if I click my little triangle, it tells me to select the new tab to create a challenge for other players to accept. Alright, so I'm going to do what he says. So at that point, he's aware of what I'm supposed to do, right? So I've got enough wire up in there that if I click the thing he's pointing at, the thing he's pointing at can report back to him, hey, that happened, move on to the next step of the tutorial. So that's kind of where I'm getting at, is it's highly centric around what I need to do and isn't protective enough about what happens if I just go to another screen. As you can see, I'm now pointing at the wrong thing. Now, to that respect, if I do this, I added semaphore, so he rushes off screen, but if I hit X, it's not total disaster. I can go and do whatever I want, you know, but it still knows it's in tutorial mode, so the very next time I come here and start a game, blah, 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 I'm starting this game, blah, 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 I'm starting this game, blah, blah, blah. And then he pops back on to continue the tutorial. So there's some intelligence in there. He just needs to get a wee bit smarter. So at this point, it goes into the pending games because that's where I've created. So it's following the natural workflow of, if I create a new game, does it send me to pending? Sure it does. And then that's where he pops up to tell you why you're sitting in pending, right? Because those have been the most confusing parts to users. So now that he's explained pending, he's like, hey, let's go to open to see what other players' challenges look like. So again, my triangle is not there, but I can click on it. And so now it's pointing to other players' games you can challenge. Whether I need to tweak this or not, I guess, is open for debate. But ultimately, these are players' challenges you can join to test your mettle, blah, blah, blah. So at this point, it sneaks down and points to the BattleCry icon. Select the BattleCry shield. I'm trying to use the term shields to drive home the affordances that you can click on shields to accept the player's challenge. So at this point, you know, I can really kind of go off rails, but the only thing that's going to get me moving forward is that shield, right? A shield on the open challenges is enough to move Baxter forward. If I go off here, now it's getting kind of rough as I go through and I'm looking at some of my other things. So again, not to try to beat myself about the head and shoulders, but I need to figure out or come up with a system that stops me from going off tutorial. So let me just go ahead and do this. He flies off screen. Again, that's just to keep him out of the way. The battle cry. This is me creating another game. This is me creating another game. Hey, I go first. And then he swoops back in. Could probably do a little bit better there. That's the latency, only because it has taken so many tries to get this right. I have got a massive game list right now that just goes and goes and goes. So there's a little bit of a latency on that, on the render time that probably isn't going to be there for people who need the tutorial, which are new players. They're not going to have nearly the number of games in the list. So here it got a little bit twisty. I was pointing at the game icon for player to, try to play. Is he pointing in an active game? What if you didn't go first? What do I do here? So I was going to try to lead them into the game at this point. I'm not sure if that's the best script. So I just sort of backed off. I mean, again, there's nothing stopping me from going ahead and playing a game right now. Probably need to do that. But I went with the story triangle to kind of head and move the story along, to talk about the little audio buttons or the ability to make friends.
Number 5.
And just to, what are these other shield icons here to, use the friend shield and audio shield to make friends and replay your opponent's battle cry. And then the other piece is, hey, take a look at all that stuff. That's the 10-cent tour, blah, blah, blah. And you're kind of done at that when you're done with that. And I just rushed through that. So essentially it's just pointing to these two things. So what I'm gearing towards is the important pieces is creating a new game. Why did it take me to the pending game list? Where do I go? How do I play this game? Go to the open game list to join a game, and then you're in the active game list, and if you've got a playable game, play it. And up here's where your friends are, here's where the high scores are. And I kind of left the rest of the interface to be explored by the user. I didn't want to turn this into a harbor tour. I didn't have a single user that didn't know what complete games were. Everyone kind of understood what a complete game was. So I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on things that were just for completeness sake, because tutorials can get quite frustrating. So that's the piping. We're going to use Baxter as kind of like the character head to tell the tutorial. I may still tweak this in part 2 of the tutorial and refine this process, and particularly I'm leaning towards stopping the user from going off the rails, which just means I need to lock down all of the other clickable items that could take a user off rails, and see if I can't control the user and then give them the ability, of course, to abort the tutorial at any point. I have not had an opportunity to show this to players yet. I'm hoping to get to some mid next week to let them start playing with it and see if that opens it up. I'm running out of people who've never seen the game before to put in front of, so I'm going to have to start walking up to strangers, I think, and see if I can get some new user first looks at it. But ultimately, that's the first rev tutorial part 1. There's a couple of areas that need some wrenching and working to get it done, but I really like the Baxter character. I think that is in keeping with the theme of the game and can resonate with players quite nicely. And of course, next week the primary goal would be to take Baxter into the game and have him walk them through an initial combat sequence, purchasing or understanding, how to buy heroes and buffs and things of that nature. So I think it's going to be critical before I get into this piece to have made the decision on which way I'm going to go ultimately with the tutorial, to allow Baxter to be maximum use here in the combat sequence. The critical areas is going to be attack. I'm not going to be able to show reinforce in an initial game, just because there isn't going to be a way to do it. I have to have 2 hexes that don't have movement in it. So I may need to stroke my chin a little bit to walk through the reinforce process, or maybe just sort of talk and artificially engineer, maybe through the tutorial. For that one game, they get an extra move or something of that nature. So there's some chin stroking I still need to do to really kind of make the tutorial flesh out, but I think the pieces and parts that are in place are moving in the right direction. All right, thank you for your time. This is Milestone 8 BattleCry, and this is task 3066.
Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz, and this is Milestone 8 BattleCry, and we are looking at issue 3066, and we're also going to sort of group in issues 3101 and 3102 into this. It was basically the game creation bug where the BattleCry dialog popped up but left the ability to create a BattleCry button active was a visibility issue, and in combat, if you're in the middle of attack but then you go to the hero store, it left the horror store open during the combat, again a visibility issue. So it was just properly managing visibility at those particular key points when instigating the pop-up. As for the tutorial, everything centers around Baxter. Baxter is our tutorial guy, and so we'll zoom in there. It's Baxter Battle Axe, and he is made up of a number of layered graphics. So his nameplate, this is his thought bubble with all of the pre-written up tutorial text, and this is basically the bubble parts, so I can move those around, and that's the little triangle button. And that's his face, the little skull, and I'm not sure if you noticed during the various examples, but his eyeballs move around and the ribbons float around, and trying to do various things to give him a little bit more character and life. So graphically speaking, and of course the pointer is his little sword or dagger or whatever that is that allows him to point at various aspects of the screen. The crux of how Baxter works is with his animator and all of his various animation sequences, all of his clips, and the default is the Baxter animation, which basically brings him in his default stance. And essentially, while this looks a little more complicated than it is, it's very linear. It goes to the new game, create the battle cry. When you create the battle cry, fly off screen, go back to the pending, then go to open games, then point to an open game, and if you're going to join an open game, fly off screen, go to the active games, create, show them the little friends and audio icon on the active game, show them where the friends list is, show them where the high scores list, and then complete the tour. So for the most part, it's extremely linear with the exception of these two flyouts, and I'm just reusing the flyout animation to get him out and back in. All of that is controlled with these booleans, so to me the easiest way to show that is to go ahead and play the game in the editor, and then we'll muck around with the booleans direct. So let's go ahead and get it to play. So there's Baxter, and go ahead and go over here to settings. I don't have my tutorial clicked, which is why he just popped up, and this would be a new player experience. And again, I can interact directly with the screen, so you'll be able to see these Boolean bit flags fly up when I do. So at this point, you'll see that the bit flag for new game. None of these animations are set to loop, so they're set to play, and then write defaults. Basically, move him to that new position so that we can pick him up from there and move him forward. So at this point, I don't have a little button to play, but what's happening is my new button is interacting with my tutorial manager and telling it, hey, let's go ahead and send him on to the next step. And so that then checks the create game. So I have a pending game selection set. So now they want me to create this battle cry. Blah, blah. Oh, wait. Blah, blah, blah. So as he creates that, he flies off screen. So he's in the off screen mode. And then when all is said and done, he flies back over into the pending game. So I'm now over here in my pending game state. And he's talking about my pending games. And I have a little triangle here to continue the story forward. And now it goes away because it wants me to kind of click on the Open Games tab. So that would be this next workflow step here. And at that point, it's describing what I'm at. So it takes me back to story mode. Let's go ahead and move over here. So that's what this is. And then when I get to joining a game, it's going to fly off again. So it's going to present for me to join this game. He flies off. So he's now here. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I get to go first, and now it's gone back. And you'll notice that I've got some of these booleans ticked on and off to control flow since I'm reusing the same off-screen animation. To get into it one way and then to get into it another way, I needed to have a way to know when I'm coming to it the second time. So at this point, I'm on the active game screen, and I can click my story to move forward, and now it's talking to me about my audio icons. And let's see if I've got any people I'm not friends with. I do. So the new user experience would look more like this, where I have a friend icon that I can click on, or an audio icon that I can click on. And then I can continue the story, in which case it's highlighting the friends list. Now, in this case, going off rails is okay. If they wanted to actually go to the friends list, they could. And so the friends list and the story icon moves it forward, right? So I can end at the high score list, or I can leave myself here at the friends list. But I'm going to go ahead and go to the high score, and that's the 10-cent tour. Now, I think during the other demos, you saw that I was in the active game, and I just used the story icon to progress it forward, and this is where the animation ends. So that's the wire up from the IDE perspective, and when I close that out, it takes Baxter out of the equation, and the demo and the tour is now over. So let's take a quick look at the code bits behind all this, my tutorial manager. So the tutorial manager is keeping track of the workflow steps, the booleans themselves, whether or not Baxter is currently active. There's an interesting thing with Unity that when I deactivate or activate a object that has an animation component on it, it resets all the state of the animator. So this is sort of my way of being able to maintain state. I'm getting access to the current player. This is my audio manager, so I can make the click noise when you click on the little triangle. And this is my menu manager, so I can move around the screens if I want to control those screen movements from within the little triangle button instead of interacting directly with the screen. So get off screen. All these are, I've got my gets and sets for all of these. And so these are just making sure that I'm active, setting the value, and then updating my animator. Right? So that goes on and on for each one of those parts and pieces. It's just a read and write accessor, really is all it is. All right, then this just tells me, hey, is my tutorial active, and just gets my active status. My active status is managed, and that is whether or not I'm setting the object active or not. And this is the crux of my workflow, the play next step. So this will come back to that. This is my refresh state and my push state. So this is sort of compensating for what admittedly Unity calls a bug, but due to backwards compatibility, they have no intentions of fixing. So there's a little bit of rigmarole that we have to do to maintain it. In the start, I grab my animator component, I do my refresh state on the off chance that you replay over and over and over again, and then I default my active status to the status of my object, which will be started, which will be true in the starting phase. So play next step is just a series of pass-throughs. So when I click on this, I make sure that Baxter is in fact active. I play my sound, and if it's not new game, then I'm going to basically make sure that he's active. So this is another way to quick start him into active state. And then I set new game to true. And by doing that set accessors, if you saw up here, that also controls setting those booleans in the animator, which kicks off essentially the animation. So as each one of these, every time I call play next step, it's going down this gauntlet to find the one that's currently false. This is that rigmarole I was telling you about, because I'm using the off-screen twice. I need to understand when to off-screen here versus the second time around. Open game. So this just is setting these booleans. In this case, when I'm joining, I want to go to open. For if any reason what I'm trying to do, this is sort of me touching base that, hey, the player went off rails, move them over to go to open anyway. So we'll see if that if ultimately that proves out to be the way to go, is to just, no matter where the user ends up going on their own, to move forward, drive them back to where they're supposed to be. And we'll see how that ends up in tutorial part 2. And then essentially follows all the way through, and then if I'm out of options, all these things are true, then I don't want to show my tutorial anymore. I want to save my player. So this is basically my settings being updated, and then I turn Baxter off, and we're done. So that's the entire tutorial set. It's mostly all done within animations and controlling booleans and managing on and off the activity of text objects to show different text and move them around and all that stuff. The menu manager, you've seen this before, where I'm going to various menus. So this is my go to active, go to open, current player. I just noticed this is a bug. I'll have to step trace and figure out what happened here. But for some reason, I'm not going to active. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with my prefab as to why that won't go, but I'll dig in and find out later. But essentially, no matter where you are, when you kick up your untick whether or not you want the tutorial to show again or not, it should go ahead and move you to the active page, at least get you to the starting place. So this was working. Somewhere along the line that stopped working. I'll have to dig in and find out why that's not working. But that's ultimately the bulk of it. When we start to show, for instance, let me click on the new game, come in here, and I want to click this new game button. You'll see what I'm doing is here's Baxter, and I'm set create game. So I'm calling one of those sets and setting it to true, and that's how the button's reporting back to the tutorial manager that you've done the right thing. Let me zoom this out so we have some landmarks. And then it's going to be the same thing on the open button, which is the other button it asks you to create, which is here's Baxter here, set open game. And again, all it's doing is pushing it further down the next step type of thing. I could have just said do next step, but then that's even more, the system is relying on the fact that I'm in the right state. So here I'm trying to force feed the fact that I want to go to open when I'm clicking on the open button. I don't know that a lot of these are fully compatible to be able to jump around, and maybe that's the way to go, is to make, instead of this being a fully linear animation, just make a bunch of disconnected clip animations, and I just run them whenever I'm in the context of what it is that I'm trying to run. So we'll get that worked out next week. The other big thing is on the new game. Let me go ahead and deactivate this guy and turn this guy on. And let's take a look at that. And I'm doing the record battle for the create new game. Okay. Create new game. BattleCry. So in this case, if I'm showing the tutorial, then I'm setting off screen to true. So this is my method for that button to control, and that forces Baxter off the screen. And as it goes through the whole BattleCry and spins through the process, that's up here. Essentially, I'm checking to make sure that I am doing tutorial, and then I will set the game depending and turn the set off screen default, and that puts him back onto the screen in depending. Now, you'll notice here I'm making sure that I am in fact in tutorial mode, but with the tutorial manager, I'm also managing whether or not I've got active status, and if Baxter's showing, I'm technically in tutorial mode. So there would be no harm in calling this method, even if I wasn't in tutorial mode. So there's just a couple of layers of protection there, and it was sort of something I inched into as I was progressing the code around. So those are the only real touch points is during the creation of a game on the new screen and the joining of a game on the open set of available games. The rest of it is story driven through the triangle, which just moves it from next to next to next to next and kind of drives the process. So not as complicated in the code, but essentially building out all of these animations and managing all these parts and pieces and getting them to move. Not a simple task. Very verbose, very meticulous. Lots of ways for it to mess up, and I think I've messed up in possibly every way that you could mess up on getting this done to get it to the point where it is now. It was a huge learning experience. The animation piece wasn't an area that I had a lot of strength with for Unity, so it was one of those do while I'm learning how to do type of environment. But there's some really interesting things that um, I think were good in the way that they were set and how they can be moved. And I'm not able to see, not active. There we go. So as you can see, his eyes sort of roll to the top of his head, and the ribbon squeeze in a little bit. But generally speaking, I think once I get all of these little animation pieces in place and I can control the environment that he's in, I think this is going to really prove to be the best way to deliver a tutorial. And again, I'm kind of liking the little Baxter character. So I think ultimately that's going to do it for this week. That's Milestone 8 in a nutshell. Issues 3064, 3065, and 3066. Again, 3101 and 3102 were mostly just, for instance, in this case, I wasn't managing visibility on these buttons. The code was in place, I just forgot to do it. So not a lot there to properly implement what was already in place. It was just an oversight of the code. Okay, that is Milestone 8. We are getting a lot closer to the ultimate vision of the game. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am looking forward to the next milestone. Thank you.